And now we're going to move into the Latin language and examine what we mean by saying that one prerequisite for an ablative absolute is two words in the ablative case. We're now going to examine what that means in the context of Latin itself. There are four combinations that make up the world of the Latin ablative absolute. The first, and by far the most common, is a combination of a noun or pronoun and the perfect passive participle, which is the fourth principal part of most verbs. Remember now, both the noun or the pronoun and the perfect passive participle will appear both in the ablative case. Bello confecto, the noun bello was in the ablative case. Confecto is indeed the fourth principal part of conficio, and it too is in the ablative case. Together, they provide an example of what I think is the workhorse of the ablative absolute and probably accounts for 85% of the ablative absolutes that you will see. The three other forms start with a noun, and now, in this case, a present active participle. You'll see a fair number of these, maybe 10 or 15% of the time. The third form is a noun plus a noun. We'll show you some examples of that in some of the following slides. And lastly, noun plus adjective. This is on the rare side, but you do see them from time to time. The key thing that I want you to remember is that both words in these four pairs will be in the ablative case. And that is the key determinant that you are looking at an ablative absolute. Both words in the ablative case. I just want to reiterate that number one, the combination of a noun or pronoun and the perfect passive participle is the workhorse of the ablative absolute world. Here are two examples of the ablative absolute that you'll see quite frequently, especially in Caesar's Gallic Wars. Verbis dictis, notice those two telltale endings, is, both ablative plurals. Translate them, when these words were said. Maybe it would have been better to say, when these words were spoken. That's a little better English. The second one, rebus factis, we would translate, when these things were done. I have, however, with the highlighter pointing it out, shown you the old-fashioned way, the intermediate step in translating ablative absolutes, with these things having been done. And some textbooks have students use this approach for a while, and then a chapter or two later on introduce the fact that good English demands turning the ablative absolute virtually all the time into one of these subordinate clauses, such as when these things were done. However, you will occasionally see a reference to the one that I have highlighted. I encourage you to move forward and translate the ablative absolute with the modern, better English style. Here are three examples from Caesar's Gallic Wars. These come from the pen of Julius Caesar and are 2,000 years old. Take a moment to look at them and study the translation. The first one, pace confirmata. Notice that long A in confirmata, confirming the fact, no pun intended, that it too is in the ablative case, when peace was confirmed. Navibus fractis. Caesar is describing a naval battle off the coast of Britain. Since the ships were destroyed. And get in the habit of being attentive and on the lookout for those ablative plural endings, for instance, the navibus and the fractis, third declension and first second respectively in terms of endings. And lastly, rebus cognitis, after these things were learned, is another example of what Caesar will use to explain the next step in his battle strategy. We move on to the second possible form of the ablative absolute, which is a noun or pronoun paired with a present active participle. And I have selected the frequently used equo currente. Notice the comma, so that if you are translating this, two ingredients of the elements of an ablative absolute are present. Two words in the ablative case, in this case the noun equo and the present active participle currente, and that very helpful comma. And now we have the translation with, I hope, a little regional humor. While the horse was running, and I then say, could we be talking about American Pharoah in the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes in New York? The spectators applauded. And I might add that the name of the horse is indeed misspelled. Now, since the participle is present, while replaces when, because a present active participle in English, words like running, playing, reading, studying are continuing actions in the present, and therefore while is much more appropriate than using the when. I might point out that the participle in this case, as opposed to the perfect passive participle, is a present active participle, and it can have a direct object. Lest we forget the most famous Roman orator, Marcus Tullius Cicero, here is a present active participle with a direct object in the accusative case, talking about Cicero. Cicerone orationem faciente. We have the required two words in the ablative case, the noun Cicerone, that is Cicero in the ablative case. Faciente is the ablative of the present participle of the verb facio, which we know quite well. Orationem, from which our English word oration comes, is in the accusative case because it is the direct object of the present active participle. And the translation is, while Cicero was making a speech. Now, in the text, the original text, there'd be a comma there, and then we would find out the next phase of what Cicero was doing. But in the meantime, you have an example of present active participle in an ablative absolute with the direct object. Up to now, our ablative absolutes have been temporal, using when and while. However, there are times when they can be causal. So here's an example from Caesar's Gallic Wars. Militibus cunctantibus. Perfect ablative absolute, two words in the ablative case, the ibus ending in third declension ablative plural. And an easy translation would be, while the soldiers were hesitating. And as I point out, however, if the main part of the sentence were, Caesar was irate, I get a hint of causality. And I think in that case we would substitute since as a much better approximation of what Caesar intended to say as he wrote this sentence. Since they, the soldiers, were hesitating, Caesar was irate. And that would be, the use of since would be much more accurate. Now we move on to the third example of ablative absolute, which is a noun or pronoun and an appositive noun. I've thrown a fancy term at you. An appositive noun is merely a noun that provides information about the other noun that it is linked with. And an illustration of that is a lot easier than looking the word appositive up in the dictionary. So the one I put down was Cicerone consule. Noun plus another noun both in the ablative case, we have an ablative absolute on our hands, and the translation most likely is when Cicero was consul. The Romans used this form of dating frequently, and whereas we would be prone to use a date in the calendar, they would regularly refer to the consulship of certain people to date an action. And very often they mention both consuls. And it's a method of introducing a date, very common in the Latin language. Now I go on to show you one where a pronoun shows up. Me consule. Noun or pronoun, and there we have me, the ablative singular of the pronoun ego, mei, mihi, me. Consule, the ablative singular of consul, and we would translate that when I was consul. Now I raise a question for you. Could it be since I was consul? And I add the mysterious and speculative comment. It all depends on what follows in the main sentence. Probably either translation is going to work, but if it sounds causal, make it causal. We now have come to the fourth and last of the forms of the ablative absolute. A mathematically oriented student has pointed out to me that I've already used up 100% of ablative absolutes, so it's going to be tough to squeeze these in. You don't see them very often. And one you might see, and notice the long A's tell you that both Roma and pulchra are in the ablative case. And the odds are that some consequence of the fact that Rome is beautiful is what will follow, like many people visit, or it is often painted, or over the centuries it is a tourist attraction. It sounds to me as if Roma pulchra is going to be causal, and we translate it, since Rome is beautiful. We're going to finish up with a fairly simple Latin sentence to put it all in perspective. Rebus factis, duly note, a noun, a perfect passive participle, both in the ablative case and that ever helpful comma. We have an ablative absolute on our hands. And we're going to translate it, which we had earlier in our lesson, as when these things were done. Could be causal. Could be causal. When these things were done, and then you have the main part of the sentence, Caesar milites ad Galliam duxit. Caesar led his soldiers to Gaul. Now we have a checklist. 1. 2 words in the ablative case. Indeed, we have rebus, ablative plural of res rei. We have factis, ablative plural of facio in the perfect passive participle. Secondly, we have the comma, well, 1 comma in this case. And lastly, and very important, although we haven't discussed it much, but it characterizes the whole theory of the ablative absolute, which is parenthetical, background information. The rest of the sentence, Caesar led his soldiers to Gaul, can stand on its own. Neither the things nor the fact that the things were done is part of the grammar of the main part of the sentence. And that is your last element of a checklist to determine that indeed you have seen and translated correctly an ablative absolute. So hereinafter, I wish you well in your Latin studies, and I know that you have become masters of, as a matter of fact, absolute masters of the ablative absolute.